There are summers a man remembers, not for what he endured, but for what he witnessed. The summer of 1887 was one of those, and the woman at the center of it was not the sort of person a valley expects to remember. She kept to herself. She wore the same gray dress on Sundays that she wore on Wednesdays. She did not sing in church, though she came every week and sat in the last pew with her hands folded on a Bible she rarely opened. The widow Ainsley, they called her, though her Christian name was Marta, and by the end of that summer, there was not a man in the county of Sweetwater, Wyoming, who could bring himself to speak that name without lowering his eyes. She was 41 years old the spring she began planting wheat, where no wheat had ever grown. Her husband had been dead 6 years by then, killed by a stray hoof to the temple while shoeing a mule that did not want to be shod. He had left her 160 acres of hardpan and a half-finished dugout on the western edge of the valley, where the good soil gave out, and the ground turned pale and hard and salt-crusted, like the surface of an old, dry sea. That was, in fact, what it had been once, though no one in Sweetwater cared to remember such things. The valley had been an inland lake 10,000 years before, and when it dried, it left behind a rim of salt flats that ran for 2 miles along the western slope. Nothing grew there. Nothing was expected to. Marta Ainsley walked those flats every evening for the first 2 years of her widowhood, and no one thought much of it, because a widow was allowed her queerness. She walked with a small clay jar and a knife, and she scraped the surface of the salt, and she dug into the pale crust with a trowel, and she carried home samples she poured out on a wooden board behind her cabin, and studied by lamplight until the moths beat themselves stupid against the glass. She was reading the ground. That was the way her husband had put it. In the margins of the old cookbook she kept on the shelf beside the salt cellar, a cookbook that was not, on close inspection, entirely a cookbook. Between the recipes for salt pork and dried apple pie, in a cramped hand that leaned to the left, her husband had written notes about soil, about water, about the way certain grains grew in the ground that other grains refused. He had been the son of a Scottish crofter, and before that a boy who had walked barefoot through fields his family did not own. He had known things about wheat that men in Sweetwater, who bought their seed from the same catalog and planted it on the same schedule every April, had never bothered to learn. Marta Ainsley had learned them from him. She had listened to him for 11 years, and she had watched him die in a single afternoon, and now she was going to plant the wheat he had described in the margins of her cookbook, on the ground the valley believed was dead, because she had come to the private conclusion that the ground was not dead at all. It was only misunderstood. The women of Sweetwater's Ladies' Auxiliary noticed the plowing first. It was late March, and the frost had barely lifted, and the widow Ainsley was walking behind a hand plow across the edge of the salt flats, breaking a shallow furrow no deeper than a man's palm. Mrs. Hollister, whose husband owned the mill, saw her from the road and reported it that afternoon at the sewing circle in Reverend Kemp's parlor. Mrs. Ballard, whose husband ran the general store, said she had seen it too, and had not known what to make of it. Mrs. Doyle, the schoolteacher's wife, laughed once, sharply, and said that grief had finally taken the poor woman all the way, and it was a mercy of sorts, in its way, because now she would be too busy dying of hunger to trouble anyone. None of them said this to her face. They did not need to. There are 3 women in every valley whose opinions travel farther than any letter, and the widow Ainsley knew, by the second week of April, that the whole of Sweetwater was aware she was breaking ground on the salt flats. She knew because on Sunday, when she took her seat in the last pew, 3 women who had once nodded to her did not nod. She knew because when she went into Ballard's store for a spool of thread, Mrs. Ballard did not come out from behind the counter and let her daughter serve her instead. She knew because when she passed the well on the town road and 2 women were drawing water and speaking quietly, they stopped speaking as she approached and did not resume until she was well past. She kept working. That was the only answer she gave, and it was not addressed to anyone. The seed she planted was not the seed the catalog sold. Her husband had brought a small canvas sack of it with him when they came west, and she had kept it dry and dark in a covered crock in the root cellar for 6 years, taking out a handful each spring and pressing the grain between her fingers to see if it still felt alive. It was a hard red winter wheat of a strain her husband had called turkey, though the name meant nothing to anyone in Sweetwater. It had come, he said, from a village on a dry plain in a country, whose name she had trouble pronouncing, brought across the ocean by a family of farmers who had learned across 3 centuries which grains would grow in ground that would kill anything softer. It was tough. It was slow. It sent roots down farther than any wheat she had ever seen, roots that would drive 4 feet into a dry season, and find water no shallow-rooted grain could touch. It was, her husband had written in the cookbook's margin, a wheat that did not mind salt, so long as the salt was on the surface and the water below. She had walked the flats for 2 years to learn which parts of them were like that. The trick she had come to understand from her husband's notes, and from her own patient scraping, was that not all of the salt crust was the same. In some places, the salt ran deep, poisoning the ground to a man's waist. In other places, the salt was only a skin, half an inch thick, laid over soil that had been washed clean by a shallow spring seep. She had found those places by walking barefoot in the early spring, when the ground was still cold, and feeling for the patches where her feet ached less. Cold conducts differently through wet ground than through dry. She had learned that from her husband too, though he had written it about potatoes. She plowed only the seep patches. She left the true dead ground alone. She broke the crust, turned it under, and planted the turkey wheat in narrow rows that followed the meander of the underground water. Her husband had taught her to read from the pattern of the winter grasses. On 160 acres, she planted 7. That was all. 7 acres of wheat in 7 long, curving strips that from the road looked like the work of a woman who could not hold a plow straight. Mrs. Doyle rode past on the buckboard the 2nd week of May and reported to the auxiliary that the widow Ainsley's field looked as though a drunk had drawn it. That line traveled. It reached the widow Ainsley by the following Wednesday, through the mouth of a 14-year-old girl who did not know she was being cruel, who mentioned in passing at the well that Mrs. Doyle had said something funny about the widow's crooked plowing. The widow Ainsley thanked the girl for the water and walked home and did not cry. She stood in the doorway of her cabin and looked out at her 7 curving strips, and she thought, they are exactly as crooked as they need to be. She said nothing aloud. There was no one to say it to. The other farmers in the valley planted straight. They planted the soft spring wheat the catalog recommended. They planted it fence to fence, on the good bottomland along Sweetwater Creek, where the soil was black and deep, and the water table was 3 feet from the surface in April. They planted 80 acres each, some of them 120, and by the middle of May the whole valley floor was a single green sheet of young wheat, rolling gently in the wind, and every man who rode past it felt the small, quiet pride of a country that was doing what it was supposed to do. It was a good spring. The rains had come on time. The creek was running full. There was no reason to expect anything but a good year. The widow Ainsley expected something else. She had read the almanac her husband had left her, and she had read the sky, and she had read the way the antelope had moved south 3 weeks earlier than they had the year before, and she had noticed that the meadowlarks were nesting deeper in the grass than she had ever seen them nest. Her husband had written in the cookbook's margin that when the meadowlarks nested deep, the summer would come hard and long. She did not know if he was right. She only knew that he had been right about other things, and that trusting him now cost her nothing she was not already prepared to lose. By the 1st week of June, her turkey wheat was 6 inches tall on the salt flats, and no one had come to look at it except her. The drought arrived without arriving. That was the strange thing about it, the thing the men in Sweetwater kept saying to each other all through June and July, as if by saying it, they could push it back. There was no dramatic day when the rain stopped. There was only a Sunday when the rain did not come, and then a week of clear sky, and then another week, and by the 3rd week of June, the men were looking at the creek and noticing that it had dropped a hand's breadth, and by the 1st of July it had dropped 2, and by the middle of July, the shallow places had gone from running water to standing water, and by the end of July the standing water had begun to smell. The soft spring wheat on the bottomland turned first. It went from green to a pale yellow green, and then to a straw yellow, and then to the color of old paper. The heads did not fill. The stalks did not thicken. The whole valley floor, which had been a single green sheet in May, became by the first week of August a single tan sheet, and then a single dust brown sheet. And the men who had walked it with pride in the spring now walked it with their hats pulled low and did not meet each other's eyes. The widow Ainsley saw this from her window. She did not go down to the bottomland. She had no reason to go, and she understood without anyone telling her, that a woman walking through failed fields to look at them would be remembered longer than a woman who stayed home. She stayed home. She stood at her kitchen window in the early mornings when the light was still gray, and she looked out across her 7 curving strips of turkey wheat, and she saw that they were still green, not the bright green of a wet spring, but the darker, tougher green of a wheat that had sent its roots down 4 feet and was pulling water from ground the shallow-rooted wheat below could not reach. She saw the heads beginning to fill. She saw the stalks standing straight. She saw, in the small private way she saw most things, that her husband had been right. She did not tell anyone. The ladies' auxiliary stopped mentioning her that summer. There was no room for the widow Ainsley in the conversation anymore. The conversation was about the Hollisters' mortgage, which was coming due, and about the Bellards' oldest boy, who had gone east to look for work, and about whether the Reverend Kemp was going to preach a sermon on Job or on Joseph in Egypt, and which one would give the men more comfort. Mrs. Doyle stopped riding past the widow's field. There was nothing to laugh at anymore, and Mrs. Doyle, whatever her other faults, was not the sort of woman to laugh at a thing that was no longer funny. 3 days into August, the widow Ainsley noticed that the smoke from the Hollisters' chimney had stopped. She stood at her window in the gray hour before dawn, and she watched the far ridge where the Hollister farm sat, and she saw that no smoke was rising. It was not cold enough to need a fire for warmth, but every household in Sweetwater kept a morning fire for coffee and for cooking, and the absence of that smoke was the sort of absence that carried meaning. She watched for an hour. The smoke did not appear. She did not go to the Hollisters. She did not know what she would say if she went, and she was not sure she would be welcome. But she noted the absence, and she wrote it down in the back of her husband's cookbook, in her own hand this time, in a column she had been keeping since July. It was a column of small observations, the sort of observations no one but her would make. On the 12th of July, she had written that the Ballard rooster had stopped crowing. On the 20th, the Doyle children had stopped playing in the yard when she rode past on her way to town. On the 1st of August, the well at the crossroads had been drawn down to the point where the bucket brought up mud instead of water. And now, on the 4th of August, the Hollisters' chimney had gone cold. She turned from the window and went out to her wheat. She turned from the window. The wheat had done what her husband said it would do, and it had done it in a summer no one in Sweetwater had prepared for. She walked between the curving rows, and she felt the heavy heads brush her skirts. And she counted, as she had counted every morning that week, the strips that were ready to cut. 4 of the 7 were ready. The other 3 would be ready within the week. She had built a small threshing floor behind the cabin from flat stone she had carried up from the creek, and she had oiled her scythe until the blade sang when she ran her thumb along it, and she had set aside 3 empty grain sacks she had washed and dried and rolled tight against the mice. She had done all of this alone. There had been no one to help her, and she had not asked. She began to cut on the 5th of August. She rose before the sun and worked in the cool, and she stopped at midday when the heat became a solid thing you could lean against, and she rested in the shade of the cabin's north wall and ate a piece of dry cornbread and drank water from the deep well her husband dug 6 feet into a limestone seam behind the house. The well was still full. She had chosen its site by the same principle she had chosen her wheat rows, by reading the ground, by watching where the grass stayed green longest in a dry month, by asking questions of the land the rest of the valley had never thought to ask. She drank slowly. She went back to work in the late afternoon and cut until the light went orange, and then blue, and then she gathered the sheaves and carried them to the threshing floor and covered them against the dew, and she went inside and slept without dreaming. On the 6th of August, a rider came up the road from the town. She saw him from the field when she straightened to wipe her brow, and she watched him come, and she recognized him as Amos Ballard, the storekeeper, though he was thinner than she remembered him, and his horse was thinner still. He rode to the fence at the edge of her property, and he stopped there, and he did not dismount. He looked at her field for a long time before he looked at her. Then he took off his hat, and he held it in both hands, and he said her name. She walked to the fence. She did not speak. She stood on her side of the wire, and she waited. He said that the creek had gone dry that morning, that the last of the bottomland wheat had blown away in a hot wind the night before, and there was nothing left to harvest, and the men were talking about pulling out, about loading their wagons and taking their families east, back to whatever they had come from, because there would be no bread this winter, and no seed for next spring, and no money to buy either. He said that Mrs. Ballard had sent him, that she had asked him to come, that she had said, and he was quoting her word for word, because he could not have found the words himself, that if there was anyone in the valley who might have thought ahead, it was the widow Ainsley, and she was sorry, was Mrs. Ballard, for every unkind thing she had let pass in her parlor these past 6 years, and she would not blame the widow Ainsley for turning him away. But she was asking, all the same. The widow Ainsley listened. When he was finished, she looked past him, down the road, toward the town. She did not answer at once. She thought about her 7 acres, and about the 4 that were cut, and the 3 still standing, and about the grain sacks in the cabin, and the threshing floor behind it, and about the deep well her husband had dug, and about the winter that was still 4 months away. She thought about the auxiliary. She thought about Mrs. Doyle on the buckboard, laughing at her crooked rows. Russia. She thought about the 14-year-old girl at the well who had not known she was being cruel. She thought, for a long moment, about what a smaller woman would do. Then she said one sentence, the only sentence she spoke to anyone that summer, and the sentence the men of Sweetwater would repeat, in various inflections, for the next 30 years, until the last of them was buried in the cemetery on the ridge above the town. And even then, it would be repeated by their sons, who had heard it from their fathers, and by their grandsons, who would grow up in a valley that grew turkey wheat on every acre and no longer remembered a time when it had grown anything else. She said, "Tell them to bring sacks." Amos Ballard sat on his horse for a moment longer. He put his hat back on. He nodded once. He turned the horse and rode back down the road toward the town, and the widow Ainsley went back to her wheat, and she cut for another 2 hours before the light failed. They came the next morning. Not all at once. That would have been more than she could have managed. They came in 2s and 3s. The men on foot, because their horses were worth less to them than the flour they might carry home. The women with children on their hips and empty sacks folded under their arms. They came without meeting her eyes at first, and she did not require them to. She stood at the edge of the threshing floor, and she pointed to the sheaves, and she pointed to the flail. And she pointed to the flail, and the men who knew how to thresh began threshing, and the men who did not know watched and learned. She set the women to winnowing in the small breeze. She set the women that came up the ridge in the late morning, and she set the older children to gathering the fallen grain from the cracks between the flat stones, and she set the smallest children to sit in the shade with a jar of water and to drink when they were told. She did not speak to any of them. She did not need to. There was a rhythm to the work, and the rhythm carried them. And by noon on the 7th of August, there was a small mountain of clean red wheat rising on a canvas sheet at the center of the threshing floor, and no one had said anything, and no one had needed to. Reverend Kemp came in the afternoon. He was not there to preach. He was there to carry a sack home for his wife, and to help thresh. And he took off his black coat, and rolled his sleeves, and worked beside a man he had baptized 30 years before, and neither of them spoke. At one point in the late afternoon, he looked up and saw the widow Ainsley standing at the edge of the field with her hand shading her eyes, watching the last uncut strips of wheat move in a small hot wind, and he lifted his hat to her briefly, and she nodded to him briefly, and that was all the sermon either of them needed. Mrs. Doyle came the second day. She came alone on foot, and she carried a sack she had sewn herself from an old flour bag, and she walked up the road and past the auxiliary women and past the men at the threshing floor, and she stopped at the edge of the wheat where the widow Ainsley was cutting. She did not speak. She stood for a moment with her hands folded in front of her. Then she bent, and she began to gather the cut sheaves the widow left in her wake, and she stacked them, and she did this for the whole morning without a word, and the widow Ainsley did not send her away, and did not thank her, And both of them understood that this was the closest thing to an apology the valley of Sweetwater was capable of producing, and that it was, in its way, enough. They worked for 4 days. When the last strip was cut and threshed and winnowed and sacked, there were 42 sacks of clean red wheat standing in rows behind the cabin, and the widow Ainsley divided them by the number of households in the valley. And she wrote out the divisions on a scrap of paper in her cramped, left-leaning hand. And she gave the scrap to Amos Ballard, and she said nothing about the division being fair or unfair, because it was neither and both, and it was what it was, and the valley would accept it, or it would not. The valley accepted it. She kept back 7 sacks for herself, 1 for each of the strips she had planted, and she kept back a small crock of the hardest, reddest grains for the next spring's seed, and she took that crock into the root cellar and set it on the shelf beside the cookbook, and she stood for a moment in the cool dark with her hand on the cover of the cookbook, and she did not open it. She did not need to. She knew what it said. The men who had planned to load their wagons did not load them. The Hollister's chimney began to smoke again. The Ballard rooster crowed on the morning of the 15th of August, thin and hoarse from disuse, but crowing. The Doyle children came out into the yard again to play. The well at the crossroads was not fixed by any of this, and would not be fixed until the fall rains came in October. But the sacks of red wheat were carried home in wagons and in wheelbarrows and on shoulders, and the ovens of Sweetwater were lit that week, for the first time in a month, and the smell of bread rose up out of the valley in a way that no man who lived through that August ever forgot. The next spring, the widow Ainsley plowed her 7 curving strips again, and she planted them in turkey wheat, and she plowed another 7 strips beside them, and she planted those too. The men of the valley came, without being asked, and helped her break the ground. Amos Ballard sent his oldest son up for a week. Reverend Kemp lent his mule. Mrs. Doyle brought a jar of preserved plums and left it on the doorstep, and did not knock. The auxiliary women, in the awkward, halting way of women who have been unkind and do not know how to under it, began to invite the widow Ainsley to the sewing circle, and she came sometimes, and did not come other times, and neither the coming nor the not coming was ever remarked upon. By 1892, there was turkey wheat on every farm in Sweetwater. By 1895, the strain had spread to 3 counties. By 1900, it had crossed into Nebraska and Montana, and by the time the widow Ainsley died, in the winter of 1911, in her sleep, in the cabin her husband had built her, with the cookbook open on her nightstand to a page that was not a recipe. The hard red winter wheat she had brought out of a canvas sack 6 years after her husband's death was the single most important grain grown on the northern plains, and no one in 3 states could have told you where it had come from, or who had plum-knockers here, who had planted the first 7 acres of it, or that those 7 acres had been planted in ground that everyone said was dead. She never told them. She never needed to. The wheat told them, every year, in the only language the ground has ever spoken. And the men and women who had once turned their eyes from her at the well went home each August with sacks of red grain on their shoulders, and they did not always as a pyramid is supposed to. And they did not always remember where the grain had come from, but they remembered in some private part of themselves that they did not examine too closely, that a woman they had once mocked had fed them in the summer they could not feed themselves, and that she had done it without a single word of reproach, and that this too was a kind of harvest, and one they had not deserved. The narrator has stood on that ground. It is still there. The salt flats still shine white in the afternoon sun on the western edge of the Sweetwater Valley, and there is still, on the 7 curving strips of ground she plowed, first, a slightly darker green in the wheat every August, as if the soil itself remembers the woman who read it before anyone else thought to look. Preparation is not stubbornness. It is a form of love for the people who will need you when they finally admit they do. If this story stays with you, the next one is already waiting by the fire.